There was a moment when Jerusalem nearly lost everything, years before it actually did. Not through war, not through rebellion, but through a command that would have made war unavoidable. Had it gone forward, the temple would have been desecrated far too soon. The city would have been dragged into conflict decades too early, and the fragile communities forming in and around Jerusalem could have been erased before they had time to mature. None of that was obvious at the time. What people saw instead were soldiers assembling and rumors spreading, and an order tied directly to an emperor, tied to the ego of an emperor who believed himself worthy of worship. What followed did not look like resistance, it looked like surrender, and it forced Rome to confront something it had rarely faced before, a people who would rather die unarmed than allow their sacred censor to be violated. From the That's Jesus channel, welcome to Coach, where church origins and church history actually coach us how to walk boldly with Jesus today. I'm Bob Balch, and on Mondays we stay between 0 and 500 AD. Today we're in about 40 AD, give or take a year or two, when an imperial order from the emperor set Rome and Jerusalem on a collision course that held history in the balance. A message arrived in Syria that turned the blood of every Jew in the Eastern Empire to ice. Emperor Caligula, he had issued an order. A colossal gilded statue of himself, dressed as Jupiter, was to be erected inside the temple sanctuary in Jerusalem, not beside it, not near it, but in the sacred space where God's presence dwelt among his people. Caligula believed he was divine, and he intended the entire world to worship him accordingly. The man tasked with carrying out this command was Petronius, the Roman governor of Syria. Now, Petronius was a career administrator, experienced in the delicate politics of eastern provinces. He understood what this order meant. The Jews would never allow it, and enforcing it would require overwhelming military force that would end in slaughter of an unimaginable scale. So Petronius assembled a great body of troops, what amounted to multiple legions, along with auxiliary forces and the artisans who would construct the statue in the coastal workshops of Sidon. The emperor had been clear: install the image or crush Judea. Petronius marched his forces south toward the border of Judea, and the statue was still unfinished at the time, but already a looming terror in the minds of everyone who heard the news. Word spread quickly, and the reaction was unified. From Jerusalem to Galilee, in village and town alike, this was not a tax dispute or a question of local governance. This was an attack on the covenant itself, on the presence of God in Israel. Jewish leaders knew their history. Centuries earlier, a Greek king, he had desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar and erecting a statue of Zeus inside. That abomination had triggered the Maccabean Revolt, a brutal war of independence that still lived in Jewish memory. Now Rome was threatening to do the same thing, but this time the response was different. There was no call to arms, no gathering of guerrilla fighters in the hills. Instead, vast crowds of Jewish men and women and children began to gather in the fields near Petronius's camp on the Galilean coast. They came unarmed. They came in waves. Farmers abandoned their plows in the middle of planting season. Merchants left their stalls. Entire families walked for days to join the protests. They surrounded Petronius and his legions, and they did something Rome had rarely seen. They begged. They did not threaten. They did not riot. They knelt in the dirt and pleaded with Petronius to spare their temple. When Petronius tested their resolve, asking what would happen if he ordered his soldiers forward, the crowds replied that they would offer their own necks to the sword before they would permit the statue to pass. The tone was not defiant. It was anguished, desperate, and utterly serious. As the protests continued day after day, Petronius made a decision that required both courage and calculation. He would stall. He could carry out the emperor's command and provoke a massacre that would destabilize the entire region, or he could delay, knowing that Caligula did not tolerate disobedience. He ordered the artisans in Sidon to slow their work on the statue. He wrote to Caligula, reporting the scale of the resistance and warning that enforcing the order would result in widespread devastation, possibly even famine, since the farmers were neglecting the harvest to maintain their protest. The delay stretched into weeks and then months, Petronius hoping that time and diplomacy or some shift in Roman politics might resolve the crisis. But in Rome, Caligula interpreted the delay as betrayal and condemned Petronius to suicide. The letter was clear and final. The suicide order crossed the Mediterranean by ship, carried by imperial couriers. But while it was still in transit, something happened in Rome that no one had predicted. In late January of the year 41 AD, near the end of Caligula's reign, a group of Praetorian Guards cornered the emperor in a palace corridor and assassinated him. He died in a pool of his own blood, murdered by the very soldiers sworn to protect him. News of Caligula's death reached Syria before the suicide order did, and when Petronius learned that the emperor who had condemned him was dead, the crisis was simply over. The letter ordering his execution arrived soon after. Petronius opened it, read the command, and set it aside. It no longer mattered. Caligula's successor, Claudius, he had no interest in desecrating the temple, so the statue project was abandoned. For the Jewish people, the relief was profound. Many saw the sequence of events as nothing short of miraculous. Caligula had been stopped not by human revolt, but by his own court. The statue, it was never completed. The temple remained untouched, and in the synagogues and streets there was a sense that God himself had intervened, turning the heart of a pagan emperor's guards into assassins to preserve his sanctuary. But there was another group watching these events with equal intensity, though their numbers were far smaller. In Jerusalem and the surrounding regions, communities of Jesus followers had been growing quietly since the day of Pentecost, about a decade earlier. These early believers, most of them Jewish, still worshiped in the temple. They still observed the festivals, and they saw Jerusalem as the center of God's work in the world. For them, the statue crisis was a direct threat to the fragile foundation of their movement. Had Caligula's statue been installed, the result could have been catastrophic. A desecrated temple would have ignited a full-scale Jewish revolt years before the actual war that would erupt in around the year 66. Now, Rome would have responded with overwhelming force, of course, and Jerusalem would have been a battlefield. And in that chaos, that small community of Jesus followers, still largely indistinguishable from other Jewish groups at the time, they would likely have just been swept up in the violence. The apostles, the leaders, the networks of teaching and fellowship that were just beginning to take root, all of it would have been at risk of being lost. Instead, the assassination of Caligula gave them time. The 40s became a period of relative stability in Judea, a window in which they could grow and organize and begin to articulate their message to a wider world. The Council of Jerusalem, that's described in the book of Acts, it took place in this decade. Paul's missionary journeys began in this decade. The question of how Gentiles could be grafted into a movement rooted in Jewish messianism, that was debated and tested and answered during this decade. When the actual revolt came in the year 66, the church in Jerusalem was strong enough to remember the warnings Jesus had given about the destruction of the temple. Many believers reportedly fled to Pella, a city across the Jordan, before the siege began. They survived, and the movement continued. But if the crisis had come 25 years earlier, in 41 AD, it could have, actually probably would have, had dire consequences for the baby church that was less than a decade old at the time. There would have been no deeply rooted and established church to preserve, no mature mission to protect, and no gospel network strong enough to endure the storm. The early Christians never wrote about this crisis directly. No epistle, no sermon in Acts named Caligula or Petronius. But the timing of Caligula's death, the survival of the temple, and the breathing room that it gave to the Jesus movement all point to something the first believers would have recognized immediately: the strange, unforced kindness of God, working through the decisions of a hesitant governor and the daggers of palace assassins to protect a plan that was still unfolding. Petronius, he never became a Christian, Caligula's assassins had no interest in theology. The Jewish protesters who knelt in the fields did not know that they were shielding a movement that would one day reach far beyond their own people. But in the economy of providence, their courage, Petronius's caution, and the emperor's sudden death, they all combined to create the conditions that the early church needed to survive its infancy. The statue was never built, the temple stood for another 3 decades, and the gospel, fragile and new, continued to spread. The moment passed without ceremony, the danger faded without a clear turning point, life resumed almost as if nothing had happened. But moments like that, they leave a trace because they challenge our assumptions about how protection works and whether we know how to recognize it all. Maybe we don't have to recognize it. One of the quiet tensions this story exposes is how rarely God preserves his people in the way we expect. We often imagine protection arriving through unmistakable signs, clear victories, public reversals, or moments everyone can point to and say, God did that. But more often, the church survives through ordinary channels: delays, paperwork, hesitation, conflicting interests, and decisions made by people not thinking about God at all. In this moment, preservation did not come through bold resistance or miraculous interruption. It came through process, through restraint, through a system that slowed instead of accelerated. God worked through the very structures that usually make believers uneasy, like political authority and human caution and imperfect leadership. He worked through those structures to fulfill his will. That can be uncomfortable for the church. We'd like to believe our faithfulness is what keeps things standing. We prefer stories where courage alone explains survival. But history reminds us that God's faithfulness does not depend on our visibility or our control. Sometimes he keeps his people simply by holding the moment back. And if that is true for the church as a whole, it raises a quieter question for each of us about what it means to trust God when his hand is steady but hidden in our lives. If God often works behind the scenes for his church, then faith is not just believing that Jesus can act, it's trusting him when his action doesn't look like action at all. Many of us carry anxiety because we assume that if Jesus were truly at work, things would feel clearer or faster or more decisive. We wait for relief that announces itself. I am relief. We look for signs that confirm that we are being kept by the Lord. And when life itself moves slowly, though, or indirectly, or through people and systems that we don't choose, we wonder if anything holy is happening in the first place. But what if Jesus is protecting you right now in ways that you won't recognize until later, if ever? What if some doors haven't opened not because he's absent, but because delay itself is part of his care? This kind of trust is quieter. It doesn't feel heroic. It doesn't give us control. It simply rests in the belief that Jesus does not need spectacle to be faithful, and he does not need our awareness to be present. Sometimes the most honest prayer is not, show me what you're doing. Sometimes the most honest prayer is not, show me what you're doing, Lord. Sometimes the most honest prayer is this: Lord, help me trust that you're already here. If this story of the temple statue crisis challenged or encouraged you, share it with a friend. They might really need to hear it. Make sure you go to thatsjesus.org for other Coach episodes and resources. Don't forget to follow and like and comment, rate and review, all those other things. In short, just do whatever you can to trick this algorithm into thinking that you care about the series. But most of all, don't forget to tune in for more Coach episodes every week. Every episode dives into a different corner of church history, but on Mondays, we do stay between 0 and 500 AD. Thanks for listening to Coach, where church origins and church history actually coach us how to walk boldly with Jesus today. I'm Bob Balch with the That's Jesus channel. Have a great day and be blessed. Sometimes on the prayer line, people will come forward for prayer, and when I'm praying for them, I just pray, I thank God for working behind the scenes. But then I just politely suggest that a small progress report wouldn't hurt. Have a great day and be blessed.